By the time a catcher reaches the majors, his knees have already absorbed more impact than most athletes take in an entire career. And the worst stage isn't even the one you're picturing. We ranked all 6 stages of a catcher's career, from the one that barely leaves a mark to the one that quietly ends careers a decade early. Little League catcher least authority. Start at the stage where the catcher's gear is on, but the catcher's brain barely gets used. At this level, pitch selection isn't really the kid's decision at all. A coach standing in foul territory, or sometimes right in the dugout, is calling the pitch type and location out loud or through simple hand signals relayed from the bench. The catcher's actual job is closer to a human conduit than a decision maker. Receive the coach's call, flash the sign to the pitcher, and catch whatever comes. That's not a knock on the kids doing it, it's simply an accurate description of where the actual authority sits. Most youth leagues intentionally strip decision making away from an 8 or 9-year-old for the same reason they don't let a kid call his own balls and strikes. The position doesn't yet have the game knowledge to weigh a hitter's tendencies, a pitcher's fatigue, or the count against each other in real time. The gear suggests command of the game. The reality at this stage is that the real command sits in the dugout, not behind the plate. Even the sign itself is usually simplified down to almost nothing at this level. 1 finger for fastball, maybe a second for something slower, with location often just shouted across the infield rather than signaled at all. There's no real cost to that simplicity yet, because youth hitters aren't sophisticated enough to exploit predictable pitch sequencing the way an older opponent eventually will. The entire authority structure at this stage exists to protect kids from a decision they're not yet equipped to make, not to prepare them for one they'll need later. Parents in the stands occasionally add an unofficial 3rd layer of input that no other stage on this list has to deal with at all. A father or mother calling out advice from behind the backstop, sometimes contradicting the coach's own signal, which the young catcher has no real authority or standing to sort out or ignore. It's a uniquely chaotic decision-making environment for a position that, at every later stage of this list, becomes defined almost entirely by how much unquestioned control the person behind the plate is given. Even within this bottom tier, subtle differences in coaching philosophy start to matter more than most parents watching from the bleachers ever realize. Some youth coaches deliberately let a promising catcher call 1 or 2 pitches per inning entirely on his own, purely as an early trust-building exercise, quietly planting the first seed of the authority he won't fully receive for years. Other programs never grant that freedom at all until a player ages out of the level completely. 2 9-year-olds with identical talent can walk away from a single season with very different early exposure to the exact skill this entire list is measuring. Travel ball and high school catcher. The authority shifts meaningfully here, though it's still shared rather than fully owned. A high school or travel ball catcher typically starts calling a real share of pitches himself, using a genuine sign sequence with the pitcher, but a coach retains override power, visible from the dugout with a system that can cancel or change the catcher's call before the pitch is even thrown. It's the first stage where the catcher's read of the hitter actually matters, layered underneath an adult's final veto. This is also where scouting reports enter the picture for the first time, even if they're informal. A coach mentioning that an opposing hitter struggles with breaking balls low and away, and trusting the catcher to remember and apply that detail 3 innings later without a reminder. The authority granted here is genuinely a test. Coaches are watching not just whether the catcher calls a good pitch, but whether he can be trusted with slightly more control the following season if he handles this stage well. The override system itself varies enormously by program, which makes the actual authority a catcher holds wildly inconsistent from one team to the next. A well-resourced travel program might give its catcher near total freedom, using the coach's override only in the most critical situations, while a more conservative high school program might shadow call almost every pitch from the bench regardless of the catcher's own instincts. 2 catchers at the exact same age and skill level can be operating with completely different amounts of real authority, purely based on which adult happens to be running their particular dugout. This is also the stage where a catcher first has to manage the social dynamics of calling a game for a teammate rather than simply receiving pitches from one. A high school pitcher who disagrees with a call in front of friends and classmates in the stands has to decide whether to shake off the sign entirely. A small visible moment of friction that didn't exist at all in youth ball, where the pitcher was rarely given enough standing to overrule the sign in the first place. Learning to hold a pitcher's confidence through those visible disagreements without either backing down entirely or getting into an open standoff on the mound is its own quiet skill this stage starts demanding for the first time. Umpires start factoring into this equation more directly at this level too, in a way youth ball rarely requires. A catcher calling for pitches on the edge of the zone has to develop a real-time read on that day's specific umpire, whether he's generous, low, tight on the outside corner, inconsistent late in a blowout, and adjust his sequencing accordingly, an entirely separate decision-making input layered on top of everything he's already weighing about the hitter and his own pitcher's stuff that day. College catcher. College is where full, unsupervised pitch calling responsibility typically begins in earnest. A college catcher is usually calling the entire game himself, working from detailed scouting reports on opposing hitters, managing a pitching staff of similarly aged teammates through their own nerves and mechanical hiccups, and making real-time in-game adjustments without a coach's sign relay hovering over every pitch. The authority here comes with a specific new kind of pressure, peer accountability. Unlike a professional staff with a decade of established trust between personnel, a college catcher is often managing pitchers he's known for less than a year, some of whom are more talented than he is and know it. Earning genuine command over a pitching staff of near equals purely through preparation and in-game feel rather than professional hierarchy is its own specific skill that has nothing to do with the physical side of the position at all. Coaching staffs at this level frequently treat pitch calling authority as something that has to be earned incrementally rather than handed over on day one. A freshman catcher might be given full control only in low-leverage innings early in the season, with a pitching coach gradually extending that trust into higher-stakes situations as the catcher demonstrates he can read a hitter's approach and adjust a sequence mid-at-bat, rather than simply working through a memorized scouting report. By his junior or senior year, that same catcher is frequently the one the coaching staff turns to for input on which pitcher should even be brought into a close game in the first place, a level of strategic input that didn't exist for him even a season or two earlier. The recruiting and transfer portal landscape has added a genuinely new wrinkle to the stage in recent years too. A catcher who transfers into a new program has to rebuild pitcher trust essentially from zero, regardless of how much authority he'd earned at his previous school, because the specific relationships and shorthand that authority depends on don't transfer with him. It's a reminder that the authority described at every stage on this list isn't really a fixed credential a player carries forward automatically. It's something rebuilt, relationship by relationship, every time the roster around him changes. The gap between a college catcher's authority and a professional's becomes clearest in exactly one area: consequence tolerance. A college pitching staff and the coaches overseeing it generally accept a wider range of experimentation and occasional bad sequencing decisions as part of a player's development, since the entire environment is explicitly educational. A professional environment, waiting just one level away, offers no such patience, which is precisely why the jump from college authority to professional authority, even though the actual decision-making mechanics look similar on paper, represents one of the steepest psychological adjustments anywhere on this entire list. Minor league catcher. The authority granted at this stage carries actual organizational weight for the first time. A minor league catcher isn't just calling a game. He's frequently entrusted with helping develop a future big league arm, working alongside pitching coaches and analytics staff to help a prospect fine-tune a new pitch or sequence, with the organization's long-term investment quietly riding on how well that development goes. The complication is that this authority is granted unevenly and under evaluation the entire time. A catcher's game-calling decisions in the minors are frequently reviewed afterward by coaching staff and analytics departments. Cross-reference against pitch tracking data to see whether his sequencing actually matched what the numbers suggested. It's the first stage where a catcher's real-time authority behind the plate is followed by a formal, after-the-fact audit of whether that authority was used well. Organizations also increasingly hand minor league catchers detailed, data-driven scouting packets before every series, spin rate tendencies, swing decision heat maps, and situational hitting splits that didn't exist in any usable form even a decade ago. The authority to call a game hasn't disappeared, but it's now exercised inside a much more heavily instrumented decision space, where a catcher is expected to blend his own in-game feel with a genuinely large amount of preloaded statistical information before he ever puts down a sign. A catcher who ignores the data entirely, or one who defers to it too rigidly and stops trusting his own read of a hitter's body language, both tend to get flagged by player development staff as needing more seasoning before the next promotion. Language and cultural differences add a layer of authority-building complexity at this level that rarely gets discussed. A meaningful share of minor league pitching staffs include players who grew up speaking a different first language than their catcher, which means building the kind of instant, high-trust communication a battery relationship depends on has to happen across a real language barrier, often without a translator present for a bullpen session or a mound visit mid-game. Catchers who develop a reputation for bridging that gap effectively, regardless of what language a given pitcher grew up speaking, tend to be viewed by player development staff as carrying a specific kind of authority that has nothing to do with their own batting average at all. Promotions and demotions across the minor league system also directly recalibrate a catcher's authority in a way no other stage on this list does quite so bluntly. A catcher who spent an entire season building deep trust with a specific pitching staff at AA can be promoted to AAA within days, walking into an entirely unfamiliar clubhouse and having to rebuild that same authority essentially from scratch, often while simultaneously adjusting to a noticeably higher level of hitting talent, standing in the batter's box against the very pitchers he's just learned to catch. MLB backup catcher. Here's the entry that surprises people expecting a clean, steady climb from bottom to top. A backup catcher is handed full, real-time authority over an established MLB pitching staff, often including a modern PitchCom wristband transmitting the call directly to the pitcher's cap, with none of the daily repetition that builds a starter's rhythm with that same staff. He has to walk in cold, sometimes after a week without game action, and immediately be trusted to sequence a complete game plan against professional hitters, often for a pitcher he's caught only a handful of times all season. That's a genuinely strange authority position, full decision-making power, minimal preparation reps to build the same intuitive trust a starter develops daily. Pitchers occasionally shake off a backup catcher's call more often than they would a regular battery partner's, not necessarily because the call was wrong, but because the relationship simply hasn't had the same repetition to build unquestioned confidence. The backup is trusted with the job. He isn't always trusted with quite the same presumption of correctness. PitchCom itself, introduced across the league in 2022 specifically to prevent opposing teams from stealing traditional hand signals, actually narrows part of this gap without fully closing it. The device lets a backup catcher select a pitch and location from a button pad on his wrist, transmitting it directly to a speaker in the pitcher's cap, which removes some of the sign memorization burden that used to make an unfamiliar battery pairing even more error-prone. But the technology only standardizes the mechanics of the call itself. It does nothing to replace the accumulated feel for a specific pitcher's tendencies, confidence level, and in-game body language that a starting catcher builds through months of daily repetition and a backup simply hasn't had the same chance to develop. There's also a distinct authority gap that shows up specifically in high leverage moments rather than throughout an entire game. A backup catcher might comfortably run a normal sequence through the middle innings of a routine start, only to find a manager or pitching coach stepping in more actively during a tight situation late in a close game, not necessarily overriding him outright, but offering suggestions a starting catcher in the same spot would rarely receive, simply because the coaching staff has less accumulated data on how the backup handles pressure specifically. The authority is real, but it's watched more closely, and trusted a little less automatically, exactly when the stakes are highest. Some backup catchers turn the role's built-in uncertainty into a specific professional identity, becoming known league-wide as a personal catcher for one particular starting pitcher who simply prefers his rhythm and game-calling instincts over the everyday starters. In those specific pairings, the authority gap described throughout this item essentially disappears. The backup, in that one relationship, holds exactly the same accumulated trust a starter builds with the rest of the staff, just concentrated into a single, deliberately cultivated partnership instead of spread across an entire pitching room. MLB everyday starter most authority. And finally, the stage where the catcher is functionally running the defense's entire night. An everyday MLB starting catcher calls the full game plan for a staff he knows intimately, cross-references, live analytics on pitch shape and hitter tendencies pumped through the exact same PitchCom system, coordinates infield shifts with middle infielders wearing their own receivers, and takes direct responsibility, in the eyes of the coaching staff and often the public, when the pitching plan doesn't work. That accountability is the real ceiling of this list. A starting pitcher who gets rocked can point to bad stuff or bad luck. A catcher whose sequencing gets picked apart by an opposing lineup gets picked apart himself. In film sessions, in post-game media questions, and in the quiet organizational math about whether he's actually the right long-term answer behind the plate. It's the only stage on this list where the authority granted and the blame absorbed are sized to match each other almost exactly. Full command of the game and full ownership of what happens when that command doesn't hold up. The technology available at this stage has genuinely expanded what authority even means for the position. Up to 3 additional fielders, typically the middle infielders and center fielder, can carry their own PitchCom receivers, meaning a starting catcher's single button press doesn't just tell the pitcher what's coming, it can simultaneously reposition an entire defense before the ball is even thrown, based on the specific pitch and location he's chosen. That's a level of real-time, game-shaping authority that didn't exist anywhere in this sport a decade ago, concentrated in the hands of whoever happens to be squatting behind the plate that night. The relationship a starting catcher builds with his pitching staff also becomes a genuine organizational asset in its own right, one that teams actively try to protect. A trusted veteran catcher is sometimes kept on a roster specifically because of the calming, steadying effect he has on a young pitching staff, even when his own offensive numbers no longer justify an everyday role purely on merit. It's a rare example in professional sports of authority and trust functioning as a standalone skill valuable enough to outweigh a decline in the more traditionally measured parts of the job. Front offices have started quantifying this kind of authority in ways that didn't exist even a few years ago, tracking metrics like framing runs, saved, and pitch sequencing effectiveness that attempt to isolate exactly how much value a catcher's decision-making adds independent of his own hitting or throwing. That measurement, imperfect as it still is, represents the sport formally acknowledging something that's always been true informally. The authority described throughout this entire list was never just a soft, unmeasurable, feel-good quality. At the very top of the position, it's genuinely one of the most valuable, if hardest to fully quantify, skills a player can bring to a big league roster. Some veteran starting catchers describe the accumulated weight of that authority as its own kind of exhaustion, separate entirely from anything physical. Every single pitch of every single game carries a small decision embedded inside it, made under real accountability for years on end without a true break. A mental load that starts all the way back at the bottom of this list as a coach shouting instructions from behind a chain link backstop, and ends as one of the most trusted, least questioned decision-making roles anywhere on a major league field. Retirement, when it eventually comes for a starting catcher, often produces a specific kind of adjustment few other positions experience quite the same way. A sudden, total absence of the exact decision-making authority that defined every single day of the job for years. Former catchers who move into coaching or front office roles frequently describe missing that responsibility more than they miss anything physical about the position. A small confirmation that the authority itself, not just the game around it, was the actual center of gravity for the entire career this list has just walked through. That's all 6 stages, least to most trusted. If you catch or coach one or just respect the position more now, drop a like and subscribe.